Hello, everyone. My name is Faith Phillips, and I am the Director of Student Financial Services at Central Ohio Technical College and The Ohio State University at Newark. I'm also a member of the Ohio Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, a nonprofit organization comprised of financial aid professionals, and the organization is providing you this presentation. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, most schools are unable to provide a host in person for the financial aid night. OASFA is providing this recorded presentation so that counselors have it to share with seniors and their parents who are just now beginning the college and financial aid application process. The information I will provide to you is generic to the overall financial aid process and not specific to COTC or Ohio State, although I will occasionally reference them during this presentation. So let's begin. Throughout my presentation, I will reference the FAFSA and financial aid. The FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid, a standard form that collects information about the student and the parent. Families do not have to pay to submit the FAFSA application. The key word is free. So please make sure when you are processing the FAFSA form that you are on the FAFSA.gov website, a site that does not require payment to submit. Financial aid is basically funds that are provided to the student to help them pay for their educational expenses. The FAFSA will collect information and calculate what we call the expected family contribution, or EFC. The EFC is a measure of the family's 2019 taxable and untaxable income, as well as current assets. The EFC is also based on the size of the family, the number in college, as well as other demographic information, such as marital status. Colleges use the EFC to determine how much financial aid the student is eligible to receive. For seniors in high school, the FAFSA that they will be submitting for next year is the 21-22 FAFSA, and they can begin completing it starting October 1st of this year. The key thing to remember about the FAFSA process is it repeats itself every year. So while the admissions process does not need to be completed every year, as long as the student stays at the initial college where they have been attending, they do need to reapply for financial aid, and the FAFSA is released October 1st of each year. The earlier a student files, the earlier they will receive their financial aid offer, and potentially the more financial aid they may be offered. Many colleges use what we call FAFSA filing priority dates or deadlines in order to get families to submit the FAFSA as soon as possible. The admissions process and the financial aid process are interconnected. And what I mean by that is most schools will not look at a financial aid application, the FAFSA form, if there is not an admissions application to match up with it. So if a student is planning to submit the FAFSA to several different colleges and wait to see what type of financial aid offers they will receive before completing the admissions process, in many cases, they will not receive any information from that college until they have applied for admission. So Ohio State is one of those schools. You can submit the FAFSA after October 1st. You could list Ohio State on the FAFSA form and it will be processed and released to Ohio State. But if Ohio State cannot find an admissions application to match up with the student's FAFSA, we won't bring it in for processing until there is an admissions application on file. So let's talk a little bit more about the expected family contribution. Again, the EFC is a measure of the students' and parents' ability to pay for post-secondary education, not willingness to pay. And the EFC has a student contribution as well as a parent contribution. So when you look at the FAFSA form, you will see that there is a parent section and a student section, and it will ask for information, income and assets for the student, and income and assets for the parent or parents. Financial aid can come from several sources. The largest source is the federal government, and that application is the FAFSA form. So through the federal government, the student is applying automatically for the federal Pell Grant, supplemental grants, federal work study, as well as federal student loans. Then many states also offer financial aid. So the state of Ohio, the Ohio Department of Higher Education, has state grants and scholarships that a student may qualify for. Submitting the FAFSA is the first way to begin the process of applying for grants with the state of Ohio. When the student lists their residency as the state of Ohio, they are automatically giving authorization to the federal processor to send the FAFSA results to the state of Ohio. And then Ohio Department of Higher Education will work with all of the schools that the student lists on their FAFSA form to determine which school the student is ultimately going to attend and whether or not they are eligible for state grants and scholarships. Also, colleges and universities are providers of financial aid as well. So colleges and universities have their own financial assistance. Sometimes it's merit-based aid, sometimes it's merit and need-based aid, meaning that they require that the student have the FAFSA on file. So to maximize the student's eligibility, they need to file the FAFSA every year. Also, parents, you might want to speak to your employers to see if they are aware of any benefits within your organization that you may use to help pay for college tuition or perhaps a scholarship application. And then private sources. So high school counselors often receive information about community scholarships and share that with their seniors. Make sure that students do not miss any opportunity to apply for any outside scholarships separate from the financial aid process. There are multiple ways to complete the FAFSA, but the most common version is the FAFSA on the web, a desktop computer version of the FAFSA form. There is still a paper application available, and less than 2% of the population files a paper application, simply because it is much easier to complete the FAFSA on the web. It has edits built into it to help the student from making mistakes, whereas with a paper application, if you fill it out and make a mistake, it takes time to get those corrections made. There's also a My Student Aid app and a FAFSA on the web mobile app. For this presentation, we will focus mostly on the FAFSA on the web desktop version. As I mentioned, the FAFSA on the web has built-in edits to prevent the families from making costly mistakes. For example, if the student says that their date of birth is July 15th of 2020, FAFSA on the web knows that's an illogical response and will pop up an error message and ask the student to correct that information. FAFSA on the web also has skip logic built into it that allows students and parents to skip unnecessary questions. So if the student is a female, it will not present the student with information regarding selective service registration. And if the parents say that they are divorced or separated, it will know to only seek information for one parent. Also on FAFSA on the web, families have the option to use what is called the IRS data retrieval tool, which allows you to go over to the IRS within the FAFSA and bring back your 2019 taxable income and put it back into the FAFSA for you. This will save you data entry time as well as the opportunity to make mistakes during that data entry. Also, FAFSA on the web has a more timely submission process. So if a family goes out to the FAFSA on the web and submits their information, it takes about 48 to 72 hours to be processed and for all of the colleges to receive the processed FAFSA. Detailed instructions are also provided on FAFSA on the web, so they do a really good job of providing help if you're not quite sure what the question is asking, or if it's an income-related question and you don't know where to find that information on your tax return or on a W-2. The instructions are very detailed on the FAFSA on the web. And the process gets easier each year. So remember, you have to reapply for financial aid every year. So next year, when you go in and you identify the student, it will pre-populate within the FAFSA the demographic information that typically doesn't change. You can update it if needed. However, you don't need to do any data entry on demographics, and you can move right to the updated taxable income, untaxable income, as well as current assets. So it makes the process easier each year. Prior to beginning the FAFSA, we encourage all families to obtain what is called an FSA ID, or an electronic signature for the FAFSA. It's a user ID and password that the students and parents create to use to sign the FAFSA form. The FSA ID is also used anytime that you need to make any corrections on the FAFSA, each year that you log in to do a renewal FAFSA, as well as if the student or parent chooses to borrow a federal student loan, the FSA ID becomes the electronic signature for the promissory note. Only the owner of the FSA ID should create it. So the student should create their own FSA ID and the parent should create their own FSA ID. Each student must have their own and the parent must have their own. So only one parent whose information will be on the FAFSA form needs to have an FSA ID. So I will use my family as an example. There are 4 of us, myself, my husband, and 2 children. My daughter has an FSA ID and I have an FSA ID that I use to sign her FAFSA. Even though my husband's information is on the FAFSA form, he is not required to have an FSA ID. Only one parent does. If at any time you have multiple children in college at the same time, each student needs to have their own FAFSA form and their own FSA ID. And then the parent who has the FSA ID can use theirs to sign each child's FAFSA form. So to complete the FSA ID application process, go to FSAID.gov and create an account. You will do this once for the student and once for the parent. Put the name, the social security number, date of birth. You will be asked to provide an email address and a mobile phone number. You cannot use the same email address for the parent and the student FSA ID, and you cannot use the same mobile phone number. You will use the email address and the mobile phone number to receive a security code that you will enter back in to confirm that you are who you say you are. Write down the user ID and password that you have created for the student and you've created for the parent. That way, each time that you need to go into the FAFSA or you need to sign something electronically, you know exactly what that FSA ID is. The FAFSA on the web, again, is the FAFSA.gov website. It is the government's website. You want to make sure that, again, that you are not on a paid website. Sometimes you won't know that you are on a paid site until you have entered all of your information in and it asks you for a credit card. And if you have done that, back out of that and go to FAFSA.gov, and unfortunately, you will have to start over. So just make sure that you start at the FAFSA.gov website. When you come into the website, you will apply for financial aid and you will click the Start Here button. You will then use the FSA ID that you've created for the student and you will begin the application process. Once you have entered in the user ID and password for the student for the first time, each time you go back in, you will be a returning user. This is what the FAFSA on the web login page looks like. In most cases, you will be the student. You will click that and use the student's user ID and password. It will then bring you to this screen. Now, the FSA ID, I should tell you, is not year specific, so you do not need to wait until October 1st to obtain your FSA IDs. Families can go out now and request the student and the parent FSA ID so that you're ready to go after October 1st when the FAFSA opens. If you were to go out to FAFSA.gov right now, the FAFSA form out there is the 2021 FAFSA form. That's for our currently enrolled students. After October 1st, the FAFSA website will have two applications out there, one for the 21-22 FAFSA and one for the 2021 FAFSA. Remember, seniors in high school right now will be filing the 21-22 FAFSA. So please make sure that you have selected the 21-22 FAFSA for your senior. So a few mistakes that we often find that families make, obviously filing the wrong FAFSA year. It does get very confusing going out there and seeing 2 years. So making sure, again, 21-22 is the FAFSA year. Make sure when you're applying for the FSA IDs as well as on the FAFSA form that you're using the student's and the parent's legal name exactly as it appears on the Social Security card. The Social Security Administration will verify that the student's name, date of birth, and Social Security number match. So you don't want to have any, you don't want to use any nicknames. You want to make sure you use the legal name exactly as it appears on the Social Security card. Making sure that you do not miss any financial aid deadlines. So I mentioned this earlier, but let's talk a little bit more about that. So many financial aid offices will set an application, a FAFSA deadline, when we would like to have the FAFSA to us so that we can get financial aid offers, especially out to freshmen as soon as possible, because we know that freshmen are trying to make decisions in early spring about where they're going to attend, and they want to see all of the financial aid offers from all of the schools where they have applied. So you will want to look at the school's website or speak to an admissions representative to see if you can find out what the school's FAFSA priority date or financial aid deadline date is. If you miss that date, that does not mean that you cannot still apply for federal and state financial aid. It just means that it may take longer for you to receive a financial aid offer, and you may miss out on smaller financial aid awards that are typically awarded to students who have met those financial aid deadlines. And again, many of us will put our financial aid deadlines right on the front of our financial aid website, or our admissions representatives will know what those financial aid dates are. So don't miss any financial aid priority dates. Also within the FAFSA, as silly as it sounds, I like to say, just make sure that you're not transposing your digits or adding extra digits. You don't want to add an extra zero to your adjusted gross income, because the last thing you want to do is help the FAFSA increase your expected family contribution. So as you're entering in any of your figures, make sure that you check them a couple times and make sure that you've entered them in properly. Once you have entered all of your information into the FAFSA, you have the opportunity to print it or at least pull the whole thing up in a view mode. And I would do that, and then you can go through and just check each line and make sure that you've answered everything the way that you had intended to. Another mistake we find are students that submit the wrong parent's financial information or don't include a step parent. And we will talk a little bit further in this presentation about who is the parent for the purposes of the FAFSA form. We will also talk about who to include in the household size and who to include in the number in college. And then we will also talk about what you include and not to include in your investments and net worth. So we will talk a little bit about a few of the financial aid questions. The first one is the selective service requirement. So males over the age of 18 are required by federal law to register with the selective service. And in order to receive federal financial aid, they must comply with this requirement. So when the student identifies themselves as being male, it will present them with this question on the FAFSA form. And then it will ask if they're registered. And if they say no, then it will ask, do you want us, meaning the FAFSA, to complete the selective service registration for you? So basically, if the student says yes to that, FAFSA processor sends a record over to selective service and gets the student registered automatically. You do not have to do this, but you do need to make sure that upon the 18th birthday, that student does comply with the selective service registration. So if the student is 17 at the time of submitting the FAFSA and you say yes to register me, it will within about 30 days of the student's 18th birthday send a file over to selective service and register the student. If the student is 18 already, it will send the file immediately and get the student registered. So it is your option, but you need to make sure that the student, once they turn 18, they are registered with the selective service. So the FAFSA will ask a series of what we call dependency status determination questions. So the federal government's philosophy is that the parents have the primary responsibility to pay for their dependent child's education. And then they go on to define what a dependent child is or a dependent student is for the purposes of financial aid. So it presents the students with these series of questions. And so the first one will be pre-populated based on the student's date of birth. And in most cases, and still until the student turns 24, they are considered dependent for financial aid purposes. So even if when the student graduates from high school, you say, I love you dearly, you're on your own, you need to pay for college, as long as the student still has a relationship with the parent and is not estranged from the parent, they still are required to provide parental information on the FAFSA form to be considered for federal and state financial aid. The exceptions would be if they were to get married before they turn 24, or they begin pursuing a master's or a doctorate program before they turn 24. So if they say yes to any of those questions, automatically makes them independent. Parents' information is not required. Or if the student has children or other dependents that they provide and will continue to provide more than 50% support for, the student can say yes to having a child. So simply having a child does not make a student independent for financial aid. The student has to be providing more than 50% support for that child in order to say yes to this dependency question. So if the student says no to these questions, it will go on and it will present them with this series of questions with check boxes. So the most common check boxes that we see affirmative to would be students who are at any time after they turn 13, both parents were deceased or they were in foster care or a dependent ward of the court. The other one that we see more commonly would be a student that has a legal guardian. So legal custodians are different than legal guardians. So if a student is in a legal guardianship situation, they can check this box and it will make them independent for financial aid purposes. The foster parents and grandparents that the student lives with, they are not considered the parent for the purposes of the FAFSA form. So if the student, again, was in foster care and can document it, or they have a legal guardian, they can check one of these boxes, will make them independent for financial aid purposes. If the student says none of the above to these, it then presents them with the final questions regarding, are you a youth that is homeless or at risk for homelessness? And if the student says yes to any of these, it will allow them to skip parents' information and be considered independent. If they say none of the above, then it will come to this determination, and it will tell the student in the FAFSA form, based on how you answered these questions, you are considered a dependent student for financial aid purposes. The student still has one more option to move forward without parents' information, and they can check this box that says, I'm unable to provide information for my parents, and I have special circumstances. This will allow the student to continue to enter in all of their information, and the FAFSA will be sent to all of the schools that they list on the school selection section. However, the school and the student will then need to communicate regarding the FAFSA and determine what are the special circumstances that prevented them from providing parental information on the form. And if the school feels that the circumstances are warranted, then the school can override the status and make the student independent. Special circumstances that we typically will consider and make a student independent would be if both parents are incarcerated, the student left the home because of an abusive environment, or the student is estranged from both of their parents, or the student does not know where their parents are and are unable to contact them. So we're looking for the student to explain to us some type of unusual circumstance with a relationship with both of their biological parents. And if they can explain it and document it to the financial aid office, the financial aid officer can make the determination again to make them independent, and parental information would not be required. Circumstances that we cannot consider in order to make a student independent would be if the student just simply doesn't live with their parents, or the parents aren't providing any financial support, they refuse to contribute to their college expenses, or they don't claim the student on their tax return, or they refuse to complete the FAFSA completely. So what I tell parents that are in this circumstance, just completing the FAFSA does not commit a parent to being responsible for paying for the student's education. All the parent is doing by providing their information is allowing the FAFSA to be sent to the school's financial aid office, and for the financial aid office to determine how much financial aid the student is eligible for. The student is ultimately responsible for their tuition in this case. And so I like to help parents understand, even if you just don't want to help with college, that's fine. But if you could just at least do the FAFSA form to help the student have access to financial aid consideration. So as I mentioned, a dependent student with a special circumstance can move forward without parental information and submit the FAFSA, and they would be following up then with the financial aid office at all of the colleges where they are applying, explain their circumstances and document them. And if the school determines that it is warranted, they will override the status and make the student independent for the academic year. So let's go back to the determination. The student has been determined to be dependent, and the student in this case is now going to provide parents' information on the FAFSA form. So who is the parent for the purposes of the FAFSA form? So only a biological or adoptive parent can provide information on the FAFSA form. If those parents are not married, but they are living together, the student must report the information for both parents. If parents are divorced, the student provides the information for the parent that they lived with most in the last 12 months. If they didn't live with one parent more than the other, then it's the parent who provided the most financial support during the last 12 months or the most recent years when support was received. In that case, if the parent that is filing the FAFSA is remarried, the step parent becomes the other parent for the purposes of the FAFSA form. So regardless of any agreements that you made with each other when you remarried about who would be taking care of each of our own children's financial circumstances for college, when it comes to filing the FAFSA form, it is the parent and the step parent's information that must go on the FAFSA form, because we're looking at the financial strength of the entire household. So we won't be looking for the other parent that isn't living in the household, but we will be looking for the step parent's information. So when you get to the parents' information, you will identify both parents, and you will label one parent will be parent one and the other parent will be considered the other parent. Keep track of who you name parent one and other parent and know which one has the FSA ID, because when you go to sign, it will ask you, is this parent one or the other parent using the FSA ID to sign the FAFSA form. Then it will ask for the student's household information. So if the parents are married, it will automatically pre-populate 2 for the parents. And then it will give 1 for the student here. So far the student has 3 and the household. Then it will ask you to include your parents' other children, even if they do not live with the parent, if the parent provides more than 50% support for them and will continue to provide that support in the coming academic year, or if those students would be able to answer no to those dependency determination questions. So in my household, we would have 2 parents, 1 student, or my student that's I'm filing the FAFSA for, and then 1 other child. So our household size would be 4. You can include other people if they now live with the student and parents, and the parents provide more than half of their support and will continue to provide that support. So say the student's grandmother lives in the household with the family. If grandmother is receiving her own retirement or her own financial support and she is contributing to her own expenses, and the parents do not technically provide more than half of that support for grandma, grandma should not be included in the number in household. So we are only looking for the people in the household that the parents will provide more than 50% support for. And then when you get down to the number in college, it is automatically going to default to 1 because that's the student that you are submitting the FAFSA for. So again, in my case, there are 2 parents and 2 children, and this coming year, I will actually have both my kids in college. So my number in college would be 2. If I were in college as well, I could not include myself in the number in college. It is only for the other dependents that can be included in the number in college. So you are now through the FAFSA part where you have identified the student and the parent and their demographic information, and you have told us that who's in the household. You're now ready to enter in the financial information. So this is where you will want to either pull out your 2019 tax returns and W-2s, or you can use the IRS data retrieval tool. And again, this allows you to pull certain tax information over from the IRS database and plugs it right into the FAFSA questions for you. This participation using data retrieval tool is voluntary. You are not required to do it. We do encourage it, again, because it prevents you from making certain mistakes. And if the student is selected for a process called verification, where the school would ask for a copy of the student's tax return to make sure that they filed the FAFSA properly, if the parents and student use the data retrieval tool successfully, that's one less piece of documentation that the school would need to request from the student and the parent. Certain tax filers will not be able to use the data retrieval tool, and this slide will give you an example of those. So basically, if the parents filed their tax returns separately, or they filed head of household and one filed married, because you weren't married at the time that you filed tax returns, but you're married now, the IRS data retrieval tool is not sophisticated enough to add that information and put it into the adjusted gross income fields right on the FAFSA. So in these cases, if you fall into any of these circumstances, you would be unable to use data retrieval tool, and you would have to data enter the tax information yourself. So when you are in the FAFSA form, it will say that you are ready to enter in the tax parent's financial information, and it will give you the link to the IRS. You can also, down in this tiny little print, say no thanks, and you can move forward and you can add the information yourself. But if you choose to link to the IRS, it will tell you that you are leaving FAFSA, you're going over to the IRS. This is what the screen will look like. You will click transfer now. You will approve it, and then it will take you back to the FAFSA, and you will now see, for example, where it asks for 2019 adjusted gross income. That field will be populated with, I believe, X's. You will not actually see the dollar figures, and that's how you know that it pulled the information over. So you will go through the student section, and then you will go through the parent section, and you will enter in each each financials. So you will, if the student worked in 2019 and filed a tax return, you will say they filed, you will enter how much they earned, and then you will move on and you will do the same thing for the student or for the parent. Then the question will ask you for both the student and the parent, what is the net worth of your investments as of today? So keep in mind, up to this point, you've been using 2019 as your measure of information for taxable and untaxable income. When it comes to net worth and assets, it's as of the date that you submit the FAFSA form. So the question will say, as of today, how much do you have in cash, savings, and checking accounts? And you just need to do the best you can in calculating how much money you have in any of those in cash, savings, and checking, and put the answer in the box. If you have an additional $5,000 sitting in your account and you know you're going to be using that to pay off a debt soon, please do that before you submit the FAFSA form. That way you can say that as of today, you've captured exactly how much you have in cash, savings, and checking. These figures are not updatable, so they are captured at a moment in time, and once you submit the FAFSA, that's the data that we will capture. Then it will ask, how much do you have in investments, business, and farm value? So the net worth is the current market value minus any debt that you have on it. This is just one question. So you will add all of the investments that you have together and put the answer in the box. You must include any real estate that you have other than the home that you live in. So if you own any rental properties, for example, you need to calculate the net worth of those and you need to report the value of those. You also report the value of trust funds, money market, mutual funds, CDs, stocks, bonds, and commodities. So pull out all of your last statements and try to do the best you can in figuring out what your cash in value would be and put the value of those investments on the FAFSA form. Again, there is a separate section for the student for investments and a separate section for the parent. So make sure that you're putting the responses in the correct section. The investments and cash savings and checking that are listed under a student are make that look mostly available to apply toward the student's education, whereas what is listed in the parent section under net worth of investments is protected in the expected family contribution calculation. So if you list that you have $10,000 in investment, FAFSA doesn't say, oh, look, you have $10,000 available to contribute to the student's education. It will only present a small percentage of that into the EFC because it knows that you need that money for future expenses, you need that money for other students. So don't panic when you're listing that thinking that, oh, they're going to think that I have all of this money. It is protected in that expected family contribution calculation. Also, if you have education benefits or savings accounts, you must list those as an asset on the FAFSA form. So I have a 529 plan for my daughter and my son. And when I've been filing my daughter's FAFSA for the last 2 years, I am required to report the value of the 529 plan as an asset of me, the parent, on her FAFSA form. I am also required to add my son's 529 plan, even though he's been in high school up to this point. I have to include the value of his 529 plan as an asset under me, the parent, in the parent section. However, had I created that 529 plan and it was in, say, one of my parents' names or an aunt and uncle's name, they are the owner of the 529 plan and my child would be the beneficiary. So that in that case, the 529 plan is not listed as an asset on the FAFSA form. Or if parents are divorced or separated and mom is filing the FAFSA and the 529 plan is in dad's name, it does not get listed as an asset because mom is not the owner and mom is the one that is filing the FAFSA form. So just be careful whose assets you are listed under and make sure that you include the value of all accounts that are owned by the parent. Assets that are not included on the FAFSA are the value of your primary residence. So you do not put the real estate value of the home that you live in, nor do you include the value of any life insurance plans or any traditional retirement plans. So your 401ks, your PERS, your STRS, your retirement IRAs, those are not listed as an asset on the FAFSA form. Also, do not re-report any cash savings and checking that you listed in the question previously. If you own a business or a farm and you have fewer than 100 employees, you do not have to list the value of the business or the farm as an asset on the FAFSA form. And if you own a family farm that you live on and operate, that is not listed as an asset on the FAFSA. So you've now entered in all of your financial information. You are now ready to tell the FAFSA what colleges you want it to be released to. And you can list up to 10 colleges and universities on the first submission of the FAFSA form. If the student is considering more than 10 colleges and universities, pick the 10 that have the earliest financial aid priority date and list them first, and then submit the FAFSA form. Again, 48 to 72 hours to be processed. You'll receive an email that says that the FAFSA has been processed and sent to the schools that you listed. You may now log back into the FAFSA record, go to the school selection section, and you can add up to 10 colleges and universities on the second submission and resubmit that FAFSA form. The FAFSA does not tell schools that you have added and subtracted schools from the original FAFSA. So once you list Ohio State, for example, on one of the transactions, and I receive the FAFSA at Ohio State or at COTC, if you go in and change that on a future transaction of the FAFSA, we are never told at the other institutions what you've done with other schools, nor do we know what order you've listed us on the FAFSA form. So if you list Bowling Green and Ohio State and Columbus State and Otterbein in that order, when the FAFSA is sent to those schools, we only see that our school received the FAFSA. I have no idea what other schools the students submitted the FAFSA to. So don't be concerned about the order or if you bump other schools off when you are adding and adjusting your school selections. For each school that the student lists that they want the FAFSA sent to, they also have to select an appropriate housing plan. So they need to tell us, based on this college and university that you've listed, will you live on campus, off campus, or with a parent? So this just determines what the cost of attendance is at each school and how much financial aid we can offer the student. This is an updatable field. So if you are going to list on campus initially and then you change your mind, you can go back into the FAFSA and the student can change the housing plan to off campus or to living with parent. So you have now entered everything in on the FAFSA. This is where I recommend you take the opportunity to review the FAFSA. I don't see it on this screen, but there is an option where you can view it so that you can see it all in one place and just check and make sure that all of the addresses and all of the numbers and everything you've entered in looks the way that you want it to. You can even print that if you would like. You're now ready to provide signatures for the student and the parent. So it will tell you, you click here, provide student signature. You will type in the student's username and password that you created for the FSA ID, click sign the FAFSA. Then you will go back and you will do the same thing for the parent that you requested the FSA ID for and click sign the FAFSA. You will know that you have successfully done that when it says student and parent signatures are complete and signed electronically, and you are now ready to submit the FAFSA and have it released to the colleges that you have listed. Do not forget this step. You can go in and out of the FAFSA as often as you want, and the information is saved on a secured website, but it doesn't go to any of the colleges until you tell it to. So we don't access this information. It is sent to us by an electronic file. So until you have clicked the Submit My FAFSA Now button, the FAFSA is not processed and sent to the school. You will know that you have successfully done that when the confirmation page pops up and tells you, congratulations, your FAFSA was successfully submitted to federal student aid. Your FAFSA will now be locked down for that 48 to 72 hours. So if you were to try to go right back in and log in, it will give you a message that says the FAFSA is currently being processed and you can't access it until it's done. On this confirmation page, you will see the date and time in which you submitted it. You will also be given an EFC right away. It will give you an idea of what it thinks that expected family contribution will be. And if based on that EFC, the student is eligible for federal Pell Grant, it will tell you also on the confirmation page. At the very minimum, it will give you a direct loan estimate. So all students, regardless of parents' income, will be offered a federal student loan. It is a loan that is offered and it is in the student's name only, and the student is the only one responsible for paying it back. We do not require students to borrow student loans, nor do we want them to take them out. But we do want students to know that those are available to them and the offer will be made to them when the FAFSA is processed with the college. As I mentioned earlier, if you have more than one student in college at the same time, they each have to have their own FAFSA form. So you have a one-time opportunity on this confirmation page to complete a FAFSA for a brother or sister of the student that you just completed the FAFSA for. So again, let's use my family as an example. I have a junior in college and a senior in high school right now. So come October 1st, I will need to do another FAFSA, a renewal FAFSA for my daughter, and I will also need to do a first-time FAFSA for my son. What I will do is go in and do my daughter's FAFSA first because it's a renewal and it's already going to pre-populate her demographic information, and all I have to do is update the new tax information and assets and submit it. So I will go into the FAFSA, I will complete hers, and when her confirmation page pops up, I will click this link and it will open up a clean FAFSA that I can now use for my son. And what it does is it takes all the parent information and puts it in my son's FAFSA for me. So I don't have to re-enter that information. Now all I have to do is identify my son and answer the income and asset questions for him, select the schools that he wants the FAFSA to go to, and submit the FAFSA form. So it saves me the data entry time when I'm doing the next FAFSA. So remember that for the future, if you ever have more than one in school, or if you have twins and triplets right now, do one FAFSA and then click that link and it will open up a new FAFSA, take your parents' information over, and saves you the data entry time. As soon as you close down this confirmation page, this one-time link will go away and you will have to enter all of the information in manually. So when you have submitted the FAFSA, it goes to the central processing system. They process it, again, usually about 48 to 72 hours. The previous slide says about 5 to 7 working days, but it's usually about 48 to 72 hours. And then the student and the parent, if an email has been provided, will receive an email that says that your FAFSA has been processed. And you can now log back into the FAFSA website and you can make a correction and add other schools if you need to, or if you know immediately you made mistakes that you need to fix, you can go in and make those corrections. Otherwise, you don't need to take any action, even though you've received the email saying it's been processed. Now it will be processed and sent to all of the colleges and universities that were listed in the school selection setup section. Again, if you find that you made a mistake or you need to add more schools, you can log back into the FAFSA form and add additional schools. So this is what the FAFSA looks like when you log back in. It will say your application has been processed successfully, and then you will see where this red arrow is pointing. There is the opportunity to make FAFSA corrections, and that's where you would click so that you could go in and make any changes or add more schools if you need to. If at any time anyone ask the student for a copy of their student aid report, which is basically a summary of the printed version of the processed FAFSA, this is where you would go to do that. Be very careful on who's asking for it and why you're providing it. So an example of someone that may ask for it would be a scholarship provider. So Licking County Foundation, for example, they have an online application process for students that live in Licking County to apply for their scholarships. And they often ask for a copy of the student aid report. I believe they've transitioned to now just asking for the front page of it, which just shows the expected family contribution. And in most cases, that's all scholarship providers should need to see, is that front page that shows the EFC. Otherwise, if you provide them the student aid report, you're providing them all of your information that you've listed on that FAFSA form. So just be cautious who's asking for it and who you're providing the student aid report to. The student aid report does not need to be sent to the colleges and universities. We receive the application electronically. So we are certainly in some unusual times right now, and previously and currently, if a student has special circumstances that are not captured in the FAFSA application process, there is an opportunity for the student to identify these circumstances to the colleges and universities to see if the circumstance could be updated or somehow reflected into the FAFSA form and potentially change the student's eligibility for financial aid. The most common one, and then the one we expect to see the most going into the next academic year, is loss of employment or income. Another common one is loss of child support. So when the family is filing the FAFSA form, remember they're including their 2019 taxable and untaxable income. And if one of the parents received child support, they will report that as untaxed income for 2019 on the FAFSA form. But child support typically ends when a student turns 18 or graduates from high school. So we recognize that change. So that is something that the student could appeal to the college's financial aid office, provide documentation that child support ended or will be ending, and then if warranted, the college financial aid office can go in and make an adjustment to the FAFSA form and show anticipated or reduced amount of child support received, thereby perhaps increasing the student's eligibility for financial aid if the expected family contribution were to go down. Other examples would be unusual uncovered medical or dental expenses. So if in 2019, for example, the family had to pay out of pocket $5,000 for medical and dental expenses beyond what insurance would cover, they could provide documentation to the financial aid office, and we could take that into consideration and see if by considering that a reduction in income, would that change the student's eligibility for aid? If at any time after the FAFSA has been processed, parents were to get divorced or a parent or spouse would pass away, that is something you would want to identify to the financial aid office right away so that we can reevaluate in looking at the family's current financial circumstances. The financial aid offices are certainly prepared for an increased number of income appeals or special circumstance appeals based on loss of income as a result of the current pandemic. So again, special circumstances are conditions that exist but cannot be documented on the FAFSA form. So the student and parent must submit the FAFSA as it requests. So you must submit it with the 2019 taxable and untaxable income. Then you would reach out to each college's financial aid office and explain your circumstances. And most colleges have an appeal process for special circumstances that the family would typically download the appeal form off of the financial aid website, fill it out, explain what the loss of income is or the change special circumstances, provide the documentation to support it, and in most cases would then break out anticipated or current income. And what we would do is compare what they've reported to what was originally reported on the FAFSA form. And if it is indeed a reduction that would change the EFC or change the student's eligibility for aid, then the college can go in and make a change to the FAFSA form, reprocess it, and use the reprocessed FAFSA to determine the student's eligibility for financial aid. Not all colleges do an appeal form. I believe most of them do, but we're not required to take into consideration any special circumstances. And the decision that the college makes is final and cannot be appealed to the Department of Education. And if the student is looking at 3 different colleges, they will need to approach all 3 financial aid offices and explain their circumstances and do an appeal form with them so that they get an accurate financial aid offer, again, as they're trying to make decisions on where they will enroll. So once the FAFSA has been processed, it will then be released to all of the schools that the student listed. Financial aid offices will start to bring those FAFSAs in, usually in November and December. The financial aid office will determine if we need additional information. So some FAFSAs are selected for a process called verification by the federal processor. It's basically just an audit process that financial aid officers are required to do if the FAFSA has been selected. And it's just to make sure that the family has filed the FAFSA properly. It is not that we are picking on families, and it is not that we are accusing you of falsifying information. It is simply an audit, a random audit, to make sure that you plugged all the information correctly onto the FAFSA form into the right section and that the EFC is accurate. The most common verification items are verification of income and a verification of the household size and the number in college. So as I mentioned earlier, if you've been selected for verification and we need verification of income and you successfully completed the IRS data retrieval, we will not come back and ask you for verification of income. That's already completed. What we may come out and ask you for is verification of household size and number in college. So on the FAFSA, you provided just numbers. So the verification document would ask you to list the family members by name and relationship to students so that we make sure that the number is the correct number that should be listed. There are other miscellaneous verification documents that the college may ask for. So students should be paying attention to their communication from the college and additional requests for information. Oftentimes those requests for information may have another deadline date. So pay attention to those deadlines and make sure that any request for additional information you respond to as quickly as possible. If you're not sure what the financial aid office is asking you for, give them a call and ask them. It is kind of complex when we start asking for additional information. So just read the forms very carefully. And if you're still not sure, reach out to that financial aid that financial aid office and ask them what is it that you are asking me to submit to you. Once the financial aid form looks the way that we feel it should look, the financial aid office is now ready to send out what they call a financial aid offer. Many colleges and universities use institutional email accounts to communicate with students when they have been admitted to the university. So many of us will send an email to the school email account and let the student know that your FAFSA has been reviewed, your financial aid offer is now ready for you to view, and you can log into our school portal. So let's take Ohio State, for example. We don't send award offers in the mail to students at Ohio State or at COTC. When we have offered a student their financial aid, we send an email to their OSU or their COTC email account saying your financial aid is now ready for you to view, and we direct them to our school portal to view that financial aid offer. Now, other colleges and universities do send out paper financial aid offers. Some send them out in really nice brochures with pictures of the university and other information with a nice explanation. It really just depends on how the school chooses to send it. And each of your financial aid offers may look a little bit different from school to school. So as you lay out all of your offers and try to compare them, they should line up a little bit, but they could look a little bit different. At the very minimum, all financial aid offers should contain the amount of aid that has been awarded from each program, how and when that aid will be dispersed to the student's account, and the terms and conditions of the student's award. As I started to talk about, many colleges are now using what we call a school portal. So I'll reference Ohio State also again. So we use what's called Buckeye Link, and it is an online resources that students access, and they use it to register for their classes, to view their financial aid, and to view their billing account. So at Ohio State, and again at many schools, we don't send bills home. When the student has registered for their classes and their bill has been generated, we will send an email to the student and we will say that your bill's been generated. You may now log into Buckeye Link and you can view your bill online. Also, as I said, many schools assign a school email account and they require students to activate those immediately and check those on a very regular basis. That will become the official mode of communication between the school and the student at most colleges and universities. So parents, if you catch where I'm going here, we will start communicating very closely with the student and not directly with parents. And part of that reason is because when a student enrolls in college, their record, both academic and finances, become protected under a law called FERPA. And students have to give us permission to speak to parents and guardians, and also for parents and guardians to access the information on the school portal. So here's an example of a school portal where a student can log in and identify a parent, assign an access code, and give the school permission to speak to that parent. So if a parent calls in, I will go to our student information release section and make sure that their parent is listed there and that they have the access code, and then I can answer any questions that the parent may have. Otherwise, we are very limited in the information that we can share with students' parents without authorization directly from the student. So it's very similar to HIPAA. So if you haven't experienced this yet, when your son or daughter turns 18, it is the same thing. You cannot get access to their medical records and medical information unless the student has authorized you to do so. Very similar to the student record when they enroll in college. That concludes my presentation. I know I have provided a lot of information in a very quick amount of time. Should you have any questions regarding this presentation or any questions about the FAFSA process, please feel free to reach out to us at outreach@owasfa.org. Those emails come directly to a financial aid professional, and we will be able to answer your questions and get you started on the financial aid process. Good luck.